Welcome, everyone, to the None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast, where we talk about the latest in business news, accounting, and taxes, all, of course, from accountants' perspectives. And with us, as always, is AJ Wheeler.
How's it going?
Charlie Ziegman.
Thanks for joining, everybody.
And now Mark Pallardy.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, guys. Thanks for being here again this week. We've got some good stuff going. And I think this week we're starting with Charlie.
All right, so I've got more exciting news from CBS News. Wells Fargo fires dozens for alleged abuse of COVID relief program. So in kind of a move that surprises absolutely nobody, Wells Fargo is the target of a new kind of scandal. And so what's been going on is that they had 100 to 125 employees who fraudulently applied for the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, and basically got up to $10,000 put into their personal accounts. And of course, Wells Fargo is in damage control mode and has released a statement letting people know that, hey, it's not going to affect your guys' accounts. It's something that happened here. All those people have been let go and that sort of thing. But I thought it brought up a good opportunity for discussion just because it's one of these things where when new programs come out that are supposed to help people, it kind of introduces these new opportunities for fraud or for financial issues. And so I want to get you guys' take on kind of, are you surprised by this happening? And if anybody has any ideas on how this kind of assistance can be given to people in a way that doesn't subject it to, misuse, to fraudulent payments.
I would say that Wells Fargo is large enough that there's going to be fraud regardless. They're such a big entity. I mean, clearly in the past few years, we've seen some fraud from Wells Fargo, and one could see that as being a problem from tone at the top. But there's probably a lot of malfeasance going on with the PPP program. And because it was rolled out so quickly, I think this is probably the tip of the iceberg of what's to come.
I think that's a good point because in the article, Chase had a similar issue. And I think that's another good, if it's something that any really large bank has happen, then it makes sense that more than one is having that issue.
I was actually Googling this right before we got on the air, and I thought it was interesting that Warren Buffett, maybe 3 or 4 days ago, there was an article that says he slashes Wells Fargo's stake. And the reason that they're giving in the article that I saw was because they hired a CEO from like another big Wall Street bank, as opposed to any of the scandals that have gone on. But what I found interesting was he's reduced his Berkshire Hathaway has cut its stake in Wells Fargo from like a high of 13% in the 90s down to like only 3.3% now. So he's at an historic all-time low of holding the bank as far as being invested in that bank. So I think it's interesting. I mean, listen, I don't think Wells Fargo is going to fall off the face of the financial earth. I mean, I hate to admit it, but I'm still a customer of theirs. And the only reason I am is for the simple fact it's hard to change banks. I mean, all of my bill pays are set up in there, all of my auto, or the direct deposits and investment. In fact, it's even linked up to my homeowners association account that I'm president for. So it'd be like a super pain in the ass to change. But I am not a fan of Wells Fargo. The website's easy to use and stuff like that. But as far as like an ethical bank, I think I'd just much rather bank with like a credit union or something like that, just because I find them more attractive. I do have other bank accounts that I use for different things, and I usually go with a credit union for them. But I've had Wells Fargo as a bank for close to 20 years, to be honest. And I'm a little disturbed at myself that I haven't taken the time to move my accounts elsewhere, but it's just a hard deal. But to your question, Charlie, I think, it falls back on the lending institution, I think, to do their due diligence, and how much of these cases were related to like the bank screwing up as opposed to the individual lender, misrepresenting what they were using the loan for. I didn't see much of that in the article, so it's hard for me to tell. I kind of like want to wait for the facts here to be able to lay blame completely on Wells Fargo if that's the case. But I don't know. I guess the devil's in the details when it comes to this. Is it the actual bank itself that just got lax and allowed these funds to go through, and they could have been used by somebody else if they did more due diligence, or is it on the lender that came, or the lendee that came in and presented a fraudulent application?
Yeah, I'm with you on that, because just in the article it talks about how there were personal actions that don't affect the customers, and so I think that's another point in their favor if that's true. So yeah, and banking is one of those things that I'm with you. It's hard to want to switch, so I don't. Yeah, I agree with that. All right, do you got another article we can? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of the facts in that case, did I catch that it was actually Wells Fargo employees that were setting up these fake businesses though?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I missed that part. Sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's just like, yeah, Wells Fargo, I don't know what it is about the culture there, right? But they continue to have these issues with employees that do naughty things.
Well, and it's 100 people, so it's like, it is the actions of the employees, but like you said, it seems to be something from the top to get that many people involved is quite the feat.
Yeah, the governance culture is and it's like, well, you can say they're a huge organization, and you're bound to have some bad apples here and there, but we don't constantly hear. I'm sure there's problems at JP Morgan or other banks, but you don't hear these kind of repeated scenarios of employees kind of doing things they shouldn't be doing, year after year. It seems like this has been going on. I mean, this is what, year 3, year 4 of kind of a recent wave of every year there's some kind of group of employees at Wells Fargo that does something they're not supposed to do.
Yep.
I just want to thank Wells Fargo for being a mainstay in this program. I think we've talked about it probably a dozen times over the last year.
Keeping us in business.
Yeah. Keep fucking up, Wells Fargo. Thank you. We have something to talk about on Fridays. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe Mark can take us to a topic that's a little less Wells Fargo-y.
Sure. One of the interesting articles I saw this week was about PayPal and Venmo starting to use cryptocurrency. I thought this was kind of an interesting take, because this is coming from The Verge, by the way, because cryptocurrency up to this point has kind of been not stuck, but pretty much regulated to one specific system where you would have to transfer the cryptocurrency in and out into dollars. Whereas with PayPal and Venmo, you can now actually store your cryptocurrency there. It'll transfer it into cash, and then coming supposedly next year, you'll be able to transfer cash into cryptocurrency. So this is going to kind of elevate cryptocurrency into a much more fungible system to buy and sell things. You're not going to have to go to your separate, I think it's Coinbank or something like that holds cryptocurrencies and transfer it to your bank in order to be able to use it. You're now going to be able to just PayPal and Venmo, which is, I think they said, used by 26 million merchants now. So it really is going to, I think, put a whole bunch of different kinds of cryptocurrencies more into the mainstream than they already have been.
One thing I thought when I was reading the article that you posted was that I was thinking about it from a real accountant's point of view. And I think this is bringing more into the mainstream of where I think more and more accountants are going to have to deal in essentially what's going to be set up like a foreign transaction exchange, where you're going to have like some kind of, from a personal standpoint. I mean, if you have Bitcoin and you transfer it over and pay things on a regular basis through like PayPal or Venmo, you're essentially having like an exchange transaction happen that is going to, move the basis, or, you have basis in the Bitcoin and then you exchange it for goods or services through the Venmo or PayPal. I think it's an interesting idea, and especially if businesses start using it that way, I think would be another interesting topic. I'm not well versed enough, I guess, in cryptocurrency to be able to identify what the unique perspectives are that would have accounting problems with it. But as somebody that's dealt with, like foreign transaction exchange differences in, days apart, I know that takes an extra step in recording and stuff. So I don't know. I think it's interesting. I think it's pushing it forward, and it's probably going to cause, more regulation and more accounting kind of treatment look at Bitcoins or cryptocurrencies. So interesting, I think, and a big move forward from what it was.
Yeah, I mean, it just adds to the credibility and the usage probably of cryptocurrencies, right? Because, businesses and users now. I mean, if these companies getting involved in this means that you can go back and forth fairly easily, that you can take your PayPal balance and move it into a cryptocurrency and then move from a cryptocurrency back into your PayPal balance, for example. I think that's definitely going to expand the usage of it, and particularly make it more viable as a medium for other kinds of business as well.
I just hope that when it becomes more mainstream that we can get better names for our cryptocurrency than like Dogecoin and all these other weird like offshoot ones. I hope that this like wide acceptance movement will lead to maybe a little bit more of a professional presentation on those.
Not a big fan of the Ethereum there, Charlie.
Nope. Sounds a little too fable-y for me.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, as accountants, the tax implications that come down to as Bitcoin becomes more and more mainstream, because it started out in the shadows and it was kind of used on the dark web to buy and sell things, and and it's obviously mineable so that people with large computers and high-end graphics cards can actually sort of mine for this cryptocurrency. So it's kind of like images of dwarves and mines mining for gold, but it's neckbeards in their basements mining for cryptocurrency, and now it's sort of come to the surface like all good things in nerd culture tend to do. And I'm curious from an accountant's perspective if 10 years from now we're going to be marking it on the books like we would any other foreign currency, like AJ said.
It seems like it. It seems like you'd have to. Yeah, it's going that way. All right, AJ, you got another one we can talk about?
Yeah, in a much more boring article I found, actually, and this was one we missed on the podcast, but actually Mark brought it up to me. The 1099 form is changing. And in fact, the IRS released a new form for starting during 2020 that they're going to receive now, instead of a 1099 miscellaneous that was basically all encompassing for independent contractors. You'd issue one to your CPA firm that, you get all these from your clients, or any kind of service firm you're supposed to issue a 1099 to. But instead this year it's a 1099 NEC. So I found an article, and actually Mark has taken CPE on this, so he might be able to correct me if I'm wrong here. But I guess businesses are to provide a Form 1099 NEC to all the following payments made in 2020. So the payment is made to someone performing services as a non-employee. Payment is for services performed in the course of the entity's trade or business, and is for $600 or more for the year. And so it basically encompasses what the 1099 miscellaneous did for businesses before for independent contractors. This 1099 NEC came about. So I thought it would be interesting. I didn't even know about this until we had a client ask about it, and I in turn asked Mark about it, and he basically had it. So maybe he can give us more of a dig on it. But I'd like to get your guys' take. Do you think this is no big deal, just another form, or something to look out for?
I think it's one of these things where it's job security for accountants, because it's yet again the IRS kind of changing the goalposts here. And there's some clarity issues, and the final regulations haven't even come down, but a lot of the stuff that we used to see in box 7 of the 1099 miscellaneous is now going to be reported on this 1099 NEC. And certain things, I think rent still stays on the 1099 miscellaneous, but legal fees go to the NEC. So it's going to be an interesting tax season, or end of January next year when these forms have to be filed. And one of the things I was thinking about was, some of these legacy accounting systems that might automatically generate your 1099s. Like if you have a version of QuickBooks that's locked in and you don't get a new version every year, all of a sudden your QuickBooks isn't going to know what to do with these forms. And the IRS is moving towards a more electronic delivery system in any case. And I've tried to move some of my clients in recent years to doing that, as opposed to sending out the mail in format. And I think the IRS really just wants electronic forms from whoever they can. And hopefully there's going to be a more streamlined way to figure out who gets the NEC or who gets the miscellaneous. But it's going to be a conversation we have to have with all of our clients pretty soon here.
That's a really great point. And I think just another point towards what we typically advise, which is that companies have cloud-based accounting systems that ideally would be automatically updated with this. I mean, obviously QuickBooks, in order to have that functionality with QuickBooks Online, will have to do what they have to do on that end, but it's certainly it's more automatic to you if you're a QuickBooks Online subscriber than if, like you said, you're a desktop owner who then has to make sure that they have their software on their desktop updated with that kind of new feature. So I'd say score another one for why we would tell companies they, in most cases, should be using some kind of cloud-based software. We're fairly agnostic, so I wouldn't say it has to be QuickBooks Online. There's other vendors, and we typically work with QuickBooks Online and Xero and Sage, and if we go up market and you're looking at things like Intact and things of that nature, NetSuite or whatever. But yeah, cloud-based options are important in today's world, and I still see so many companies that resist it, and often some firms that resist it, that want to do everything desktop. It makes me cry. Makes me cry when I see small businesses who switch accountants and they revert back to some kind of desktop because that's what the accountant wants to use, and now they went from a more advanced workflow to a less advanced workflow, and that kind of thing makes me cry.
I just I just want to say it's one of those things that I've been seeing in not just IRS stuff, but like even in the UK, they've got this movement they call Making Tax Digital, that is basically moving everybody away from paper forms and into a cloud-based connected system with HMRC. And so I think it's part of a trend we're seeing in the overall world, that everything is going to kind of just turn to digitized records. And yeah, so people who are holding out, now's the time to get on board.
I do have to say, at my last firm, in my office was the only typewriter in the whole office, and I wanted to throw it away so badly. But the only reason they kept it is there was one form for like some Canadian province or something that they had a client with, that you had to type out like some kind of shitty form. And here this damn typewriter was in my office, and it was used like once a year to type like 3 lines onto and I couldn't understand why I couldn't do it on a computer, why I had to have this stupid typewriter in my office. Anyway, you got another article for us, Charlie?
Yeah, I've got another one we can talk about. So this one's from Reuters. It's called Blue Wave U.S. Election Expectations Trigger Green Stocks Frenzy. And so what's going on is that I haven't been hearing as much about this as I would like to, but there's a strong expectation that Democrats will win a lot of major elections soon, and that's going to cause there to be more governmental spending on environmental technologies and environmental companies and alternative energy and that sort of thing. And so what they're seeing is that the stocks that are in that arena are outperforming a lot of other stocks. And so stocks that have nothing to do with the environment and that sort of thing. And so it seemed like, I guess it was interesting to me from the standpoint of, it's interesting that the environment has become something associated with democracy when we're all just like sort of in this environment anyway. And it seems like something that everybody would be able to agree on as humans, rather than having this be like a political divide on what we think is going to happen. And so I guess I just want to get your guys' take on whether or not you think that it is the blue wave the reason why green stocks are doing better, or is it that the world is just using alternative energy more efficiently than it used to, and it's not a political issue, it's just an environmental issue as being a human. What do you guys think?
Well, I have to say, the article kind of got into the where politics and business mix, and I'm not saying that they don't, but for general, I'll stick with Gary V on this one and say, I don't think it much matters for business who's in the White House. Brand always wins out. But I think what's interesting is the capitalization on the election from a business standpoint. In fact, on LinkedIn today, I saw there was a whole CPE brought to you by an infamous kind of sales CPA kind of guy. And it was on how to sell tax planning based on who wins the election. This was an actual course by 2 CPA guys on how to sell tax planning based around who wins the election. And I'll be honest, I don't, and so these guys haven't even really pushed any kind of legislation through. We're not even sure who wins yet. And yet they're selling CPE based on who's going to win. I thought it was like a hard political sell. And I feel like probably this article steers that same way. I think they're trying to correlate something that maybe doesn't have any correlation. It might just be a coincidence. Like you said, I think people are looking to invest more in green energy and get away from a depleting source. So I think maybe they're trying to show causation where there is none, or, correlation where there is none.
I agree with you for the most part, AJ, but I definitely think that the blue Democratic platform is geared more towards green energy and green energy infrastructure. And even the Republican side will constantly kind of claim the Green New Deal is what the Democrats are all about. Last night, historically speaking, when we're recording this, last night was the presidential debate. And, even both sides agreed that solar energy and some of these other forms of alternative energy are increasing, and both sides seem eager to have that happen. I think from a political standpoint, if Biden wins the presidency, you'll likely see him push more on the infrastructure realm in that direction, as opposed to gas and oil. But I think the article also points out that regardless of who wins, this is still going to happen, and it's kind of inevitable. It's just the speed at which this is going to occur.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the blue wave definitely affects this from the standpoint that green energy development, the economics behind green energy development, is very dependent on government regulation and incentives. And so, as it stands today, it still is very dependent on that. And so, there are a lot of businesses or industries or entrepreneurial ideas that center around government programs, and this would be one of them. Like if you're a green energy developer, or if you are wanting to sell, and I've talked to some of these folks actually. I've talked to some folks out of Texas just in the last couple of weeks that are gearing up for this exact thing, to basically kind of be in the next kind of bubble industry, right? That we get in these waves of things that are really popular and everybody's into them for a little while, and sometimes we call them bubbles. And that green energy area is definitely on people's minds in correlation with a democratic regime, because historically over the last 20 years, democratic administrations have been the proponents of more incentives and more economically beneficial regulation for green energy projects. So yeah, I definitely, there is a strong correlation there. I mean, if I were an entrepreneur that was inclined to take advantage of moments in time, that would be that, if that was the kind of entrepreneur I was, that would be something I would do. I might build, like in accounting, like maybe you go out just like people have built practices around being cannabis accountants. You could build a practice around being a green energy specialist, right? And this would be a good time to do that if you're kind of thinking in that line, along those lines, right? Just like there's a lot of people out there who have made a name for themselves this last year being PPP and COVID incentive specialists, right? I mean, there definitely are cottage industries that come up around specific political movements, and this is historically one of them that are like that. So I think that is the case. I think Mark hit it right on, that it may be that the industry itself has its own momentum without government interference over a longer period of time. But the idea that there's kind of a big boom in the industry in the next year or so would totally be related to the current political environment.
Makes sense. All right, AJ, you got another one we can talk about?
Let's see. So this one comes our way from Entrepreneur. And so it's actually an article written. The person that wrote the article owns a large app development company. So the article is called "The 10 Biggest Mistakes My App Development Company Made in Our First 10 Years in Business." So I'd like to run you through the list and maybe get your guys' idea if maybe he missed one or if he's dead on. So one, the tax man cometh. So he said, in our first years of business, we thought it would be wise to show how profitable we were. We even made sure we cashed a massive check from a client at the end of December to close out the year with even more earnings. And of course, what he found out was he paid more in taxes and quarterly tax estimates because of that. So world is not flat. We started our company. We got really excited about the idea of keeping our organizational flat, but he said that just wasn't unsustainable and that there needed to be some kind of hierarchy within it. Establish core values. So as the business grew, the team grew. However, we kept hiring and losing employees, which turns out it cost them quite a bit of money. And they realized that having core values and a culture around them would keep people there longer and be able to pay them a decent wage. Enjoy the moment is one that he said. So he's like, savor, with it comes the headaches, but savor the wins. And 5 was there's no silver bullets. So there's no easy answers, what he was saying, as far as like getting something done when you're growing a business. And so he's saying that like the tactic was to make small steps progressively forward instead of trying to shoot for the moon. Design your culture to have a cadence. So instead of like thinking of it as like a cool place to work or happy hour every Friday, very superficial, he said that the company would have benefited from more meaningful team bonding. And I'm pretty sure we lost clients when they saw our office looking more like a hacker house than a place where professionals lived. So he's, like trying to bring in a more professional look. Marketing should be authentic. Focus on building relationships was another one he said. Know when to say no. So he's talking about taking on too much or not being able to slow down and be able to know when you see a bad client, not to take them, but at first, and I'm sure many startup businesses are aware, they just take whatever comes in the front door. But it's nice to be able to choose good clients and be able to identify them. And then he said, don't let your gas tank run out. So he said, you need to be able to take time off and sketch through, like your next period and be able to, take time away to be able to strategize a new way in the business. So anyway, I'd like to get your guys' take on it and if there's any maybe parallels to either our own business or businesses we work with.
I mean, I saw a direct parallel to something that I always say about client engagement and taking on clients in terms of what he said about that, because when he was writing about, don't take on a bad client, the discussion was a little more nuanced, right? In the sense that what he was talking about was taking on, and he actually used the phrase, taking on a client engagement where the value that you provide is precarious, or that it's not clear where your value in that project actually is, that will always come back to haunt you. And so that doesn't mean, think about it, that, in that case, that's not necessarily a value judgment on the client itself, although he kind of framed it that way. I'll mention how in a second, but I would say it's not necessarily, right? You can have a client or a company that you would love to work with. They're potentially a great client, but nevertheless, it's a bad engagement. It's not a bad client. It's just a bad engagement, because what they're asking to have happen or what they're trying to get you to do is not something that you can actually add a lot of value to. And that is a precarious situation. And he directly said the exact thing that I say, is like, you have that choice that you come to the table and they want you to do something that doesn't really fit within your normal value proposition, and they're willing to pay you. So do you just take the money and do it? Or do you step back and say, oh, that's not really the kind of thing we normally do, or we don't see how we add value to that? And I've always framed that, you guys have heard me, I may have said it on this podcast before, in the show before, but I frame that in our industry, being in the accounting world or in the finance world, are we like doctors or are we like mercenaries? And I've said, we haven't been perfect about how we do that. Sometimes we end up more in the mercenary camp than the doctor camp, but that's how I frame that same exact notion, I think, is this idea that, a client comes to us with these issues, and often they're saying, I'll pay you a bunch of money to do something to reach an objective, but you know what their objective is, but they want to pay you to do something very specific, and it's questionable with what they're paying you to do will actually reach their objective. A very clear example of that I've worked with before, when I worked at a CPA firm, we don't have this problem in this way now because we don't do this kind of service. But I used to be a partner at a CPA firm, and I remember having entrepreneurs that would come to us and ask for us to do an assurance service where we would actually do a compiled GAAP financial statement for them. And the reason is because the bank wouldn't even have a discussion with them about a loan for something that was really a venture, and they were trying to take on more debt in order to fund the future of their business, right? And I could look at the scenario and be like, well, there's no way this bank's going to fund you when they know what I know about your business. You don't meet the normal lending criteria. But they skipped past that conversation and just wanted to pay us to produce a generally accepted accounting principles compiled financial statement or reviewed financial statement or whatever, because the banker, the salesperson at the bank who doesn't know what I know about their own underwriting, because a lot of times these sales folks at the bank don't know their underwriting as well as we do. And so that salesperson is just trying to throw as much crap against the wall as they can toward underwriting, hoping that enough sticks that they'll get through the process. But what that salesperson doesn't appreciate is that we're going to charge that client a bunch of money to do an assurance service where we compile a financial statement for them. And it's money that's wasted because we already know ahead of time that we'll never reach the objective that they're trying to reach. So what do? Do you just do it because they come to you, you know what their objective is, but they've skipped past asking you to help diagnose their issue and prescribe a solution, and they've already prescribed the solution to you. They've said, we have an objective and we know the way you can help us is preparing this financial statement. So do you just take their money and do it, even though you know it's not actually going to help them? And I would agree, and I think that's in line with what this article was talking about on that front. And I would agree with their conclusion. Every time I've done that, I've regretted it. And I've done it, but I've regretted it. So there you have it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one of those things that will just happen a lot, but it seems like the best you can do if that person is in that situation is to just explain to them and have them actually buy in and understand. And I think they'll lie and say, okay, I think I get that the bank is going to say no, but I kind of just don't believe you. And so I'm just going to go ahead and buy the service anyway. But I mean, if they actually understand that it's a no and agree that it will be a no, it seems like the only type of defense that you can have to that situation is to just by engaging, you agree you're not getting a loan, which is the goal of the loan of the financials.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You can still protect yourself from a legal perspective in those kind of relationships, but it's still, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you're legally right. It still ends up being a bad situation for you, for that engagement, for that relationship, and potentially for relationships you might have with anyone else they know.
That's true. That is very true.
All right. Well, I thought there was more meat there, but go ahead, Charlie. You got another one?
Yeah, I can do another one. So I've got one from CNBC, not to do so many political ones, but years of low interest rates have made the current economic crisis worse. And so it's the author of this article's opinion that part of the reason we're having such a bad economic crisis is because Feds have kept the interest rates so low during times where everything was going better, and that has encouraged overly risky behavior, and that has put us in a precarious position once things actually start hitting the fan, so to speak. And so I guess, I want to get you guys' take on whether or not you feel that low interest rates over a long period of time are as much to blame for the worsening of our economic crisis, or is that just actually factors that are not, is it different factors?
I actually was having this very discussion with a friend of mine who's actually got a doctorate degree in economics. And I posed the question to him. I said, they're talking about lowering interest rates again. This was back, I don't know, maybe 6 months to a year ago. This is right when COVID was starting, and they were talking about lowering interest rates again. And my thought to him was, like you only have two economic solutions for what they're proposing. You release more money or you lower interest rates. And if you keep lowering interest rates, you don't have anywhere else to go. And he was as confused at it as I was, because I was thinking maybe he had a better take on it because he had this economics, doctorates in economics. And we both arrived at the same conclusion that I don't know where you go from here, I guess, because they've been so low for such a long time, since 2008 almost. They've been kept really reduced. Now, this has meant that there's been opportunity for people that can, receive loans to be able to do a lot during that time. And we have seen an economic increase during that time. But what we're seeing is external factors besides that slow our economy. So I don't necessarily know if we can continue this, but I'm not smart enough or know enough to be able to offer an alternative.
Sure. And I'm not going to claim to be an economics expert either, AJ. But, when we started into this period of growth under Obama and then continuing under Trump, there were quite a few economists who thought keeping the interest rates super low was a dangerous proposition, because oftentimes lowering the interest rate is the emergency trigger that you can use to help stimulate a lagging economy. And yes, having low interest rates certainly spurns the economy, but when you use it, it's like keeping your foot on the gas pedal and having it floored the entire time. Eventually, the momentum and the inertia can only take you so far, and ultimately you don't have that trigger to pull anymore. I mean, I know economists are way smarter than I am and can figure out other ways of doing things, but I remember hearing a story a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, how interest rates were in the negative category. And it's like, what does that even mean? Does that mean if I take out a bond, I'm gonna owe more at the end than I've even invested in this bond? Clearly I'm not an economist, so there's people who would do that for some reason, but it seems like we're taking that tool away from the Fed to use. And I kind of agree with the conclusions that this article came to, but it's like, we're going to have to kind of figure this out. Now is not the time to start raising interest rates to figure this out. Now we actually are in crisis. So, stimulating the economy and keeping people fed and keeping money in the system, as I've heard you guys talk about in previous podcasts, seems to be, a good way to stimulate the economy that will at least keep things chugging along until we are past COVID.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like anything else. Making something expensive is a brute force way of making people value it more or making people manage it better, right? I mean, that's true with any resource. And so I think that's the same. That's what the article is getting at with cash, is that because we've made cash so inexpensive, we've made it costless to get piles of cash with low interest rates, people make dumb decisions with that cash. They take excised risks more than they should. And particularly this article was inspired by the fact that, we've got probably an upcoming problem or crash related to commercial real estate because nobody's using offices anymore, right? And so that kind of highlights the fact that people really, companies, businesses are that were in the business of commercial office real estate overextended themselves with all the low cost cash that they had available. And so, the idea is, well, people they took excised risks, they made suboptimal decisions because the cost to them was pretty low to do so, because the cash was so inexpensive with low interest rates. And that's the same thing you can say about kind of any asset, any asset or resource out there, right? Is like, and those of you out there with kids, or Charlie with kids, as you raise kids, you start to think about, well, how do I use money as a way to make our children value more of what's going on, in terms of do I make them buy certain things themselves and they have to earn the money to do it and stuff like that, right? To me, it's the same kind of philosophical thing of saying, essentially that's what they're getting at is, well, if cash wasn't so inexpensive, if people had to pay money for it, then they'd be more responsible with how they use it, right? And I refer to that, and that's why I refer to that as it's kind of a brute force way of managing that issue to some extent. The alternative way is to do it in a more complicated, a more comprehensive set of regulatory environment, right? Which is, people don't like the idea of more regulation, but that would be the alternative, is to, rather than a brute force, oh, we're just going to make cash more expensive, having more guidelines on who gets that cash, and and how do they substantiate whether their projects are worthwhile for it, right? Increasing. It's always been amazing to me, after the home mortgage crisis, we immediately, the government, social programs, not-for-profits, progressive activists, everyone was already immediately, very quickly looking for reasons why we should be giving loans at lower down payments, and the arguments are compelling, right? I mean, there are people who can't afford to buy homes. This is different than commercial real estate, right? But I make this connection in my mind because I remember thinking about this right after the mortgage crisis. It was within a few years, if you qualified for a certain program, you could now get a house with a 10% down payment because it was your first house, or maybe you had, some special need or whatever. And it's like, we just went through a mortgage crisis where we had a bunch of people borrowing money who really weren't qualified to do that. And we didn't learn anything from it, because as soon as we could come up with a reason, we started giving loans to people with lower down payments, right? So, I mean, I just think about that right away in the sense of that would be one, you don't have to mess with the interest rate for lenders to require higher down payments, for bank regulators to require banks to require higher down payments, and not to provide special exceptions to those higher down payments for every special program or need that they want to benefit, kind of thing, right? That would be a different approach to that problem, without necessarily changing, still making cash available at lower cost, but regulating to some extent the risk factor on some of that cash. But yeah, I mean, it's complicated. Just adding more regulation is complicated, and all the conservatives out there ready to hang me for even suggesting that idea. So, yeah, I mean, and I recognize that too. I recognize that the more regulation makes it more complicated. So yeah, raising the interest rates or keeping interest rates a little bit higher is the brute force way to essentially affect that issue, and without other complicated regulation. Just make it more expensive for people to have cash, then they'll be more responsible about it, right? That's the thought process.
I think maybe that's the Facebook relationship status for 2020. It's complicated.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it definitely, I will say that I've experienced working with the finances of a company that has had negative interest applied to them in the EU, and it definitely made us want to move cash around and that sort of thing. Your thing about the kids really hit home with me, because I do a move with them that the government can't do, which is that they just have no idea what that stuff is worth. And so basically I can just get them to do any amount of work for that, and it works out great. But yeah, the government can't quite do that. The article did talk about how lending standards have been tight, and so there is some effort to kind of work towards your conclusion there that it should be tighter to lend, but there's of course levels to that, and yeah, we're far off of what would be maybe a more conservative approach on that. All right, Mark. So yeah, I think we've said everything we can say on that topic. Do you got another article we can talk about?
Yeah, I found an article from Ars Technica about what we know about the antitrust case that was filed against Google this week. Antitrust legislation is kind of one of those interesting things that doesn't happen very often. So I thought it was interesting, not just from a technology point of view, but from an accounting point of view as well. And Google, is one of these behemoths like so many other tech companies that we have nowadays. But this antitrust case is just approaching Google search so far, in that their practices have been the cases that their practices have been anti-competitive with them, requiring Google search or just defaulting Google search onto new phones, into new computers, even, different operating systems, and making deals with carriers so that their Google search becomes the primary dominant factor, which it already has been, but it's left other search engines. They specifically mentioned DuckDuckGo, but there are other smaller search engines who can only get a very small percentage of the market share. And while Google might respond and say, well, there are certainly ways that people can change our default, as anyone knows who maybe has a less than tech savvy relative where they're setting something up, going beyond the default is not usually the case. I think one of the interesting pieces that they juxtapose this with the AT&T antitrust case and the Microsoft antitrust case. And, I was listening to another podcast that was kind of discussing this, and it seems like in the past, the government has had a lot more money to kind of put into antitrust regulation. And in AT&T, that was back in 1974. And when that happened, it kind of created all the baby bells, is what they call them, because they kind of took apart this behemoth that was AT&T. And then with Microsoft, when they filed their antitrust, that was kind of, it really aided in IBM not being completely dominant and taking over the entire market share. And then, we have an infrastructure now in technology where, because of these kind of forced government cases, companies behave for a while, and then other smaller companies can sprout up. I mean, this doesn't even go into Google advertising or all the other pieces of the puzzle that make Google what it is. And, frankly, we use Google for a lot of things on a day-to-day basis, and Google is a great product. But there are other smaller companies and entrepreneurs that feel shut out of the process because this can look like monopolistic behavior. I'm not going to judge Google and say whether it is, but you look at some of these big technology behemoths who kind of buy out some of their competition in order to stifle growth or just to have greater market share. And for them, it's a good value proposition, and then they can grow their company. But for those smaller companies who are trying to compete, all of a sudden, you might only have 2 search engines that you think of, or 2 phone companies, or whatever that looks like. So I'm interested in what you guys think about this kind of lawsuit being filed. And who knows what it's going to look like if an administration changes in November as well. I mean, this was filed by a Republican DOJ, but there's talk about whether a different administration would even pursue this.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, you have a monopoly when one of the top 2 competitors is named DuckDuckGo, because it's like, there's, what are we doing here, guys? I mean, Bing is like, the next best name to come up in the list of other search engines, and that one's bad too. So I do think that, Google wins for a reason. I do think that the article talked about how a lot of their apps kind of force you into the other apps. And so it creates this ecosystem. And I do think that's very true. It feels like a pretty innocent practice when you're like setting it up to have, one of your like products relate back to one of your other products. But it is kind of a good point to say, like, yeah, we all use Google for everything, because everything you do, Google Mail integrates in Google Calendar, and we go on and on we go. So yeah, I thought it was interesting to like, where do you draw the line on that kind of anti-competitive behavior, and what is just true innovation, so.
I think what this will highlight is how outdated, I guess, the laws are based around, because if we're talking about the AT&T antitrust, that was based on like when they broke them up by geological location. And anymore, you pin down Google's location. Sure, they're based out of San Jose or whatever, but it's the World Wide Web for a reason. And it's like not a physical location. It's the same reason why the laws are so slow to change for like nexus taxation or anything like that. I mean, where is it? It's like, it's nowhere, but it's everywhere, so and the fact that there's, like Mark said, yeah, Opera or any of these other, there is small search engine providers that you can go to. It's not completely monopolistic in the way that you would think about it, but Google does have a stranglehold over everything. They're in everything.
I mean, I don't know if there's a legal difference in the antitrust laws, but to me, there is a philosophical and economic difference in how the monopoly actually comes about, right? I mean, you can have an end result that, we can all agree that, Google dominates the search space, right? But it's economically and philosophically how it got there is different than AT&T or the television broadcasters or the railroads or these, classic scenarios where you had monopolistic powers that came about in part because you had to get to a certain size and then you could basically buy up all the capacity. And there's, you could buy, there's only so many players that could be there with the, or the infrastructure, let me say it that way, that the infrastructure of being able to deliver whatever that product or service is owned by the big conglomerate. And so they control the entire distribution chain, and they control the entire channel, and they control everything that would it take to get to where they're now at as a monopolistic power. And I think that's the essence of what's being debated here is that really true with Google? I mean, Google is, the result is that they are a dominant search engine presence, but is it really true that they control the entire path that it would take for someone to build a new search engine? Is it impossible to build a new search engine because Google owns all the infrastructure that it would take to get there, in other words? Because that's the way it worked with some of these other big companies, other scenarios that we talked about. And so, yeah, I think that's the essence of Google's argument is like, we don't really, there's nothing that technically prevents, right? We don't own anything or have a monopoly on the underlying infrastructure that would allow somebody to build another search engine. The reason why we have this market power is because the market has decided that we have the best product. And that's different than controlling the market because you control all the underlying infrastructure. And so, and like I said, I don't know if that's different from a legal perspective, but it seems different to me from an economic perspective.
I think one of the other things that the article brings up, which I think piggybacking off of what Ty says, it's like, what do we value in the US? Because if you look at Europe, they've already successfully sued Google 3 times, once related to search, once related to Android, and once related to their ad product. And a large part of that, and they've had to pay huge fines in Europe. And a large part of that is because Europe doesn't have this kind of free market mentality that the US has, that it's kind of way more regulated and constrained. And that's something that the American economy values, but yet antitrust legislation exists to take down something like the railroads, or like what AJ was speaking about in terms of geographical locations with phone companies. And so where do we draw the line? I mean, obviously the laws need to be updated. And I'm not suggesting more regulation, but what do we value as a society versus what other places value? And when you're acting on a worldwide stage, how do you accomplish what you want to accomplish as a company? Not that Google's hurting or anything.
Well, I think you would have had I think if you look back at like the 2010s and you would have tried an antitrust suit against cable companies for the delivery of internet, I think you would probably have a much stronger case because they own the means of delivery, much like AT&T owned the means of delivery of telephone service when the antitrust law was given. I mean, to this day, we're fortunate. We live in Portland, and usually people have a couple options as to who's going to provide their internet service. But if you go to rural Kansas, you probably have one choice, or there's very many places around the country that only have one choice in who provides internet service to them.
100%. I mean, that's exactly the comparison I was thinking about, because even though you said we have a couple of providers here, it's like, well, there's Comcast, and then there's like a crappy second that you can choose because you hate Comcast, which a lot of people do, right? But it's not like but seriously, I mean, like if you like want serious internet, I mean, you actually don't have that much choice. To me, that's much more concerning to me than because the Google monopoly is a monopoly of people's preferences, right? It's not that I literally can't get on another search engine. It's not, and it's not that the infrastructure prevents somebody from creating a search engine and from me connecting to it, but the infrastructure actually prevents me from using a variety of other internet providers in our area. That's not practical, in my opinion. So yeah, I mean,
Well, like here's an example. I was just thinking about it from the other side. I mean, if all of the search, if gaming search terms is something that businesses generally want to do, and if Google is the leader in that, then you end up in a situation where whether you choose to use Google or not, you're forced to play into their game because search is so heavily dominated by them that from that perspective, you as a person have your own choice. You can use any browser you want. Good luck, right? But as a business, it's not, the choices are not as varied. And it seems like that could be part of what causes it to be so, I don't want to say controversial because we all love Google. Can we just talk about how we hate Comcast for about 5 minutes or so? Because it's easier. But yeah, what do you guys think?
Well, I think in respect to the cable companies or the internet providers, our Lord and Savior Elon Musk will save us with Starlink. I think it'll come back. We'll see a shift in the market once the satellites have launched, and we're all under his control. But no, I'm joking here. But I think as far as internet delivery, I think going forward, you're going to see more competition. And I think that'll be an interesting argument if Starlink, for instance, takes over traditional means of getting internet. Not everybody can just shoot a satellite up in the air, but you can dig a ditch and put in wires. Anybody can do that. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see, I think, where we go from here as far as the delivery of internet and who provides that.
But
yeah, and I remember. Oh, sorry, Ty.
Yeah, no worry. Yeah, go ahead, Mark. You're gonna.
I remember a couple years back here in Portland where we were promised Google Fiber was coming, and man, did I get excited when I thought, oh, I can get out of the Comcast vice grip, and so, I waited and I waited, and then all of a sudden that was another one of the projects that only now I think is in Tennessee and one other place. And if they had succeeded with that, it would add to their portfolio that is seen as ever growing and dominant. But frankly, I wouldn't complain. So, it's like, is there a value add, as referring back to what Ty was saying earlier? And it's a tricky proposition because you want to help out the small guy, but you want the best service possible at the same time.
I think that's right on. Another way to look at this, another paradigm for this is the regulation, is the legal wrangling that goes on here, is it designed to protect the consumer, or is it just designed to help potential competitors, right? Because that's the thing, is that with truly abusive monopolies, what you see is this kind of attitude that you're hearing from us about Comcast. Sorry, Comcast, but it's this idea that even, and also like what we said earlier in the show about Wells Fargo. Oh, we use it, but it sucks, right? That's the result. That kind of consumer attitude is the result of a somewhat abusive monopoly, right? Where consumers are locked in to using a service where they don't get the best service. They're not treated the way they would like to be treated, but they feel like they really have no other choice. And that's why, in my opinion, that's politically why there are antitrust rules, is to deal with that issue as much as anything else, right? And so I think that's one of the defining factors with this Google issue is think about it, don't we think that if Google's products were bad or they didn't do well with their products, that would just open the door for other innovators to bring, like, there's no systematic reason that a Ducky Go-Go couldn't couldn't overcome Google if Google's service was terrible and DuckDuckGo was really great. But that's actually not the truth of the situation. I mean, Google's products are actually fairly good. They keep doing good things with their product. I mean, I'm sure there's people out there who have complaints about them, but on the whole, they must be doing okay. And that's what's actually preventing competitors from getting inroads, is because they actually provide, they value with their service to that point. It's not consumer. This is not being driven by a consumer-centric problem.
I know. I think you made the point perfectly by saying their name wrong, because it just goes to show you how terrible that name is. That's the reason why everybody's using Google, is because that's the only thing they can remember to type. So yeah, they couldn't have done it better.
I still wish it was Lugo. Nobody remembers Hot Tub Time Machine when he stays in the 80s and he knows everything that's coming up, so he makes Lugo. Yeah, Lugo instead of Google. No. He was a head lead singer for Motley Crue. No, it's a must see.
We don't watch the same stuff on Netflix, but yeah, that's fine.
I'm an idiot, so whatever. All right, I got an article here. So maybe the 10 things from the app guy was too many. So I got 4 outdated rules every business owner needs to ditch. So these are kind of like traditional rules of work that, and this is another one from Entrepreneur. So I'll give you the old rule and kind of what she sees as the new rule. And I thought they were pretty interesting. So old rule is traditional office hours, being at the office from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 or whatever it is. The new rule being active hours and having folks that work an active shift. So if you're active from, say, I don't know, 11 a.m. to, if you're putting in your hours, 11 a.m. to, I don't know, 7 p.m., whatever it is, if that's how you feel comfortable working, that's what should be afforded to you by your employer. The next one is the old rule, standard 40-hour work week. And then the new rule being flexible scheduling. So they talk about, obviously, in the year of COVID, there's a lot of things that worked, but the 8-hour, I guess, work week was created way back when. And there's research that proves that shorter work days and shorter work weeks are fantastic ways to improve quality of life and quality of work for your employees, is what she says. Old rule, too much or too little oversight. New rule being accountability. So this talks about how instead of, micromanaging or undermanaging, where you're just kind of left to your own devices, that there's accountability on deliverables and having, you with weekly check-ins or key metrics or some kind of balanced scorecard that keeps you on track and keeps you moving forward. Old rule being be a good manager. New rule being a great leader. This is kind of woo-woo, I think, a little bit, but being, a leader instead of a manager, I think it's simply in the phonetics of the word as opposed to any real difference here. So, but I'd like to get your guys' take. Anything that resonates with you, or you think maybe she completely off base with?
Yeah, I think the hours thing really resonates with me, as far as just, as far as, it's interesting because they say that your active hours should be what drives your work, but that assumes that you want to spend your active hours working. So I guess it depends on what you're actually wanting to do with those active hours. But yeah, it seems like the normal 8-hour shift is maybe eroding or changing as things get more global and that sort of thing. And having everybody stay from home has made, flexible hours seem like the, thing of the future.
Yeah, I don't want to necessarily cross the streams here, AJ, but I personally looked up an article that was talking about the CFO of 2030, and it was interesting how your 4 outdated rules kind of dovetailed quite nicely with my article on the CFO of 2030, because they talk a lot about technology and kind of embracing that idea of, being future forward. And a lot of that has to do with being flexible with your employees and, building these relationships with people and meeting them where they're at, which I think, having flexible scheduling falls into that, having active hours of when you're more likely to work, and then kind of embracing what that looks like going forward, embracing new talent and kind of looking to a future forward workplace. So I think from a staff level and a managerial level, you kind of can see, I mean, and it could be that all these articles are written during COVID. So everybody's like, my crystal ball is out and I can tell exactly what this world is going to look like for the future. But people like working flexible hours. People like working from home. And as technology improves, I think I can't disagree that this is the direction we're headed.
I mean, I've always been big on flexible hours and kind of letting people kind of design their own schedules in their life and trying to integrate those. Basically design their work and their life the way that works for them. I think in doing that, the problems that I run into and that I think still apply even when we're all kind of working remotely and I think the article tries to get at this a little bit, although I didn't quite understand the timeframes they were suggesting. But the problem you run into is that, particularly if you're in a leadership scenario or you're providing a lot of service to other people, you're meeting with people all the time, you have to be active during the same time all the people you might want to meet with would be active. There has to be some kind of commonality to that, right? And it's super convenient. That is one thing that is super convenient about the standard 9 to 5 or whatever, is that if the whole world is operating on that, you kind of know, oh, I can schedule my meetings during that time and I can be pretty assured that my coworkers, my vendors, my customers, or whoever are going to be operating during those hours, right? And so it adds more complexity to the scheduling process and certain more complexity. That's it. It adds more complexity, surely, to collaborating and scheduling if everybody truly is just operating on kind of their own schedule, be it in the middle of the night versus during the day or whatever. And the article did talk about that a little bit. I mean, it talked about, well, having active hours where you're scheduled and that your teams are going to be around during those active hours so that you can kind of ping them or do meetings during those times. But what I was referring to is like their active hour examples were like between 2 to 5 or in the afternoon, or maybe somebody works from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. And it's like, well, I'm not a morning person. So if their active hours are 2 hours between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., we'll never talk to each other, right? So that's a problem. If it's 2 to 5, we'll probably talk to each other, but that doesn't even seem like enough hours. I mean, I think what I thought about the article, the naive part of the article, I would say, is it doesn't account for just the sheer amount of meetings some people have. I think a lot of us have a lot of meetings and a lot of collaboration with other people, and that's like 6 hours a day at least, if not the full 8-hour day or more and so the idea that we can just have those hours anytime we want is fanciful because of the fact that we're having to basically hit the same hours that other people are hitting. So yeah, it's like somebody was telling me earlier that, it was AJ was talking about his vacation plans, and I was just laughing. I was like, yeah, you can take vacation wherever you want. Just make sure that you're available by email or phone during those times, and that's a joke because I don't really want that to be how we do things. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that the people who work with me know that, like, I don't tell them when they should start work or when they should leave, but they end up working during kind of regular business hours because of this dynamic that I'm talking about, the fact that they kind of have to meet with people during the same hours everybody else is available to meet. So I don't know how that plays out with all of this that we're going through and work at home and everything.
Well, I think it's a good point, right? Like, in what we do, we work when our clients are working. So it's not like I could work from 8 o'clock at night until 5 a.m. and expect to have clarity on what I'm doing. My clients are usually available from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. So that's what time I need to be available, and I need to be available to provide them service, answers, set up meetings with them for the kind of things that we do. So my active hours are based on my clients, and I think it also depends on where you are at in your journey of your career. If you're a staff accountant at a public accounting firm, you're probably going to have to be available. Your active hours are probably going to have to be available from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. if you're in a public accounting firm. I don't know any managers or supervisors out there that would be like, yeah, my active hours are from 2 to 5. Don't bother getting a hold of me in between any other hours, like that. I don't think it would go over that well. But so I think it all depends on where you're at in your career path as well. But I see us moving to a more flexible kind of scheduling and flexible kind of work moving forward. And the pandemic, I think, has accelerated that.
Yeah, I think you guys are right on. I got to say, I agree with all of it. Yeah, the only other thing I was thinking is just that, like with globalization and with so many other different countries, that sometimes trying to work with somebody who's, their 9 to 5 is a weird hour for you. And so flexibility can come in good there if you wanted to work at some weird hour. And so I have seen that kind of happen. But it's like you said, it's hard to rely on if nobody has a set time that they can be reached. And I'm with you, AJ. I know most of my clients wouldn't be happy if I got, told them I'd been working all night and here's the work that I did, because that doesn't give them the chance to integrate or to, be a part of it at all. And so, yeah, I agree.
All right. So the last article I have is actually kind of a follow-up to some of the article, kind of a topic we had before as a request from our friends over at Westward Whiskey. But this was from the Rob report, whatever that is. But I guess whiskey cask are now outperforming gold as an investment. So, and they're also outpacing Bitcoin in the S&P 500. So the tagline in this is essentially, if you bought $100,000 in whiskey cask produced in July of 2018, you would have $160,000 at the end of this past June. Perhaps even more surprisingly, it asserts that investing in popular digital currency, Bitcoin, the S&P 500 index, or even gold, which is a standard safe bet, they say would have yielded the same level of returns. So I'd like to get your guys' I was kind of shocked by the amount of return on this, but I think it's probably more of a pandemic sort of thing of investment or something, where we've seen an increase in things like liquor sales in states that are legal marijuana sales. And we've talked about it on the podcast due to the pandemic of those industries kind of being in a boom. I think this is probably like a result of that, but the whiskey cask investment that we had talked about previous on the show, I thought was interesting to see that the return on investment was so high.
The only kind of I think the article is right. And I think that it makes sense that that whiskey is doing well, especially in a time like this. The only thing I think is a little bit questionable is their comparisons are something very specific to something super broad. And so it seems a little bit like, maybe, I don't want to say cherry picking, because maybe that's not fair, but it seems like we're taking two very different things and then noticing that they're different. And so it's just, I find that a little questionable, but other than that, I think it sounds right. And yeah, I think now's the time for whiskey, maybe more than ever.
Are you saying you don't trust the Rob report as a beacon of financial reporting?
I've never met this Rob fella.
Well, and it would be interesting to see what maybe a longer term, market for this would be. Are they just cherry picking two dates that gave them the widest spread? Or is this actually something that is held over time? I mean, one of the more interesting parts of the article, I thought, was that there actually exists these markets, these kind of underground markets to buy rare casks of whiskey, and there's places in Japan and other places you can kind of put your money down on whiskey that's going to age for you, and it seems like a really interesting investment.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it from the distillery side of the finance opportunities here, right? Of using people buying the whiskey while you age it and provide services to them as a finance vehicle to finance the operations, right? I mean, because part of what I was reading was you can buy the barrel of whiskey and then the company you buy it from can basically age it for you. So you're paying that company up front, but it's still sitting in their warehouse all that time. And I don't know if it was this article or another one where I think they talked about, or maybe I just dreamed it up, the idea of, I probably didn't just dream it up because I'm not that clever, but but okay, so if you can leave the barrel in the warehouse and have the distillery age it for you, then you can also have them take it out of the barrel and mix it and do what needs to be done and then bottle it for you as well, right? So, I mean, it could be that the entire distillery's business model is to pre-sell all their barrels and then kind of provide the service of aging barrels and then bottling for consumers from there. And they're basically getting their money ahead of time. They get a lower margin because they're not picking up the profit on having actually got that appreciation, that great growth that we're talking about, the speculative growth on storing the whiskey and aging it. But yeah, I mean, if you're a young distillery looking to generate some cash flow, you don't have a lot of funding, and this might be a way that you can generate some upfront cash flow in building your whiskey brand.
All right, everybody, that's been our show. Thanks for watching and listening to the None of Our Businesses podcast, and tune back again next week for more updates in the world of business from an accountant's perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.